should be able to be seen there.
Yeah.
This morning because of having to.
Oh, I get it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So. Yeah, what?
I just make they could let people in.
Yeah, there's somebody.
Yeah. Myrna was just let in, so it's just. Good morning. Somebody just flashed the lights. I think that's the cue for all of us. Oh! Ooh, sorry. I think the mic's loud. Let me move this down a little bit. All right. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to see everybody here today. How's the weather? Treating everybody a little cooler this week, a little nicer, not as hot as the week before. I want to start with a word of prayer before we get into long suffering. I don't imagine we'll take all the time today talking about this. I think Henry was next. Are you ready, Henry, to begin if I don't finish? Okay, I mean if I finish early? Good. All right. With that, let's go to God in a word of prayer before we begin. Let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, we are so thankful that we can call you Father, that we can come before you, that we can seek help in our lives from you, that we can count on you to hear our prayers. And we're thankful for the many blessings you give us. We're thankful for the peace that we find in you and in your Son. We're thankful for the gift of salvation that we have, and we're thankful for your patience with us. We want to praise you for the glory of this world that we live in, the beauty of the mountains around us, the water, the forest, and for the wonders of all that we see. We're thankful for, and we want to praise you for the creativity that you've put inside of us that we see on exhibit, and all that man does in this world. We want to give glory to you for that, knowing that though the world might think and be proud in its creation, we know and understand that all comes from you. That the cities we build up, the land that we change, is all at your will and at your convenience. And we We just want to praise you and recognize that all that we see comes from you. Thank you so much for this family that you've blessed us with, and we pray that we have open hearts and open minds as we dive into your word this morning, as we seek to understand your long suffering and what that means for us and how we can imitate that. And these things we pray in your son's name. Amen. All right. So last week we covered mercy and grace. Whoops. And then just a quick recap. As this book explained, mercy is receiving forgiveness instead of justice. Is being shown. It's hard to not use the word mercy. It's being shown. I guess patience in a sense, which is what we're going to get into with long suffering. But it's when you deserve judgment, but that judgment is withheld. Grace is receiving good things that you don't deserve. And so they're very closely tied together in that, because often when you receive grace, you may have deserved judgment. But on top of that, just understanding that the example used of grace was King Hezekiah. He was a good king. He was told he was going to die, and he prayed to God for more years, and God gave him 15 more years. And that was an act of grace that God gave him. He blessed Hezekiah with an additional 15 years of life. And that's not necessarily something that Hezekiah deserved or didn't deserve. It was just a matter of God wanting to do something good for this good king that he'd had. When we looked at mercy, let me go back and see what example we used for mercy, because I'm forgetting. Does anybody remember what example we used for mercy last week? Well, I don't. But God's mercy is shown when the Israelites worshiped the golden calf at the base of Mount Sinai, and he sought to destroy them, and Moses pleaded on their behalf, and he didn't. He didn't start over with Moses in that moment. He continued with the Israelites. Mercy shown when David held the census, and God had a plague sweep through the land, and David went and bought a piece of property, and he bought the oxen on it, and he made a sacrifice to God, and the plague stopped there. It didn't continue. And that was a time when judgment was owed, and judgment was shown, but it was stopped short. So those are examples of mercy. Long-suffering, it was odd to me as I was going through this book that long-suffering was the third and not the first of the words, of the characteristics of God that we're going through. Because in my mind, long-suffering precedes mercy and grace. Long-suffering comes first because it is what happens when we fall short. God is long-suffering with us. And it's only because of his long-suffering that we have opportunity for mercy or for grace. If God was impatient, if he did not show us long-suffering, judgment would come immediately, and opportunity for mercy and grace wouldn't be there. Yes?
I was always thinking that it was the mercy and the grace that brought on the long-suffering. God would not have been long-suffering unless he was merciful.
And that's a fair point, actually. I mean, it's kind of a chicken and egg kind of thing. Is God long-suffering because he's mercy and gracious, or does he have opportunity for mercy and grace because he's long-suffering? So I can see that makes sense to me as well.
I don't see him long-suffering in mercy, because if I'm needing mercy, I don't want him to wait. Because
I don't mean long.
I need that. Like grace.
Yeah.
Grace, he's long-suffering right now. He's waiting. How long is he waiting for people to come to him?
Yeah.
So he can extend grace.
Yeah.
And so that point of long suffering becomes very important.
Yes. No. And I want to make sure I'm not speaking past you and you past me here, but like in the desert with the Israelites, as they sinned and sinned and sinned, and God was patient with them and showed them mercy. I mean, maybe they do just go hand in hand more than we can pull apart one over the other. So, yeah. With that, why the words long-suffering? Like, that is the words that we use to describe it. But what does, because often we use patience, but long suffering is also many times used. What does that mean? Why long suffering? Kate?
It's hard.
Because it's hard, because it's painful, because it's suffering. I think suffering is an intentional word there. Patience is not that patience hides the pain in its word, but it doesn't give light to it. It doesn't help us understand that pain that goes along with the longness of it. The example we're going to go to here is Luke 15:11, the story of the lost son, the prodigal son. The father waited a long time for his son to return, and it wasn't a joyous time while he waited. It wasn't full of peace and pleasant living. It was difficult. It was hard. He was concerned for his son's life. He was concerned for his son's well-being, and he waited longing for his son's return, so much so that when his son finally did return, the father was already out there and was able to greet him on the road before he even got home, running to him. I don't picture the father in a sun chair underneath the shade of a tree waiting for his son to return. I don't picture him just enjoying himself as he's out there. I imagine if somebody came and talked to him, he would be distracted as he had his eyes on the road, waiting for his son to return. This is a focus thing where he's looking looking for his son and waiting for him to come back. I'm reading all that into the text. It's not there. But this is what comes to mind. This is the imagery that comes to mind when I think of a father waiting for his son who he believes to be lost. That's not a pleasant thing. Why is this important, though? Why am I making such a big deal about it? When we're going through these lessons on the character of God, I want to understand what the words mean, and I want to understand that they belong to God. But if I'm seeking to have a relationship with God, with our Creator, I want to know what that feels like. If I'm supposed to imitate that, I want to be prepared to know what that feels like. Because for me, growing up, I heard about patience and long-suffering, and I thought, I'm a patient and long-suffering person. I can do that. I can be patient and long-suffering. And then something happens, and somebody has wronged me, or somebody in my life is, maybe not wronged me, but they are pursuing a path that is dangerous, away from God, away from our family. And then am I patient and long-suffering? Like that's, oops, careful, there's a mic there. That's a test. That's a test of my patience and long-suffering at that point. Because if I'm not prepared to endure the suffering, then I'm not prepared to be patient.
You can be long-suffering as long as you don't have to suffer.
Exactly. No, exactly. That's the easy part, right? I mean, we can all agree on that, can't we? Like, that's easy. You know, like, oh yeah, like somebody doesn't get something done at work and it doesn't have that much of an effect on you. It's a neighboring job and it's their fault anyways. Yeah, that's fine. You can do it next week. You can do it whenever. But when it starts to affect you, when these things that happen in your life start to affect you, then it's a different matter. Yeah. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that? Yeah, Terry.
If we look at long-suffering in the context of what the Bible says and how it's used with God, if you go to 2 Peter 3:9, the answer's right there. And he is not willing that any would be lost. And so that's his purpose for being long-suffering, is he wants everybody to come to him.
Absolutely.
So it's the patience of the sins that people keep committing over and over and over.
Yeah.
Or not turning to him yet. He's enduring that because he wants no one to be lost.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that brings something to the forefront here too, and that's that we want to understand what it is to be long-suffering so that we can be prepared for that. But we also want to understand why is God long-suffering and why should we be long-suffering? What is the end to that? It's not just something that we do because it's a good thing to do, but there's a hope at the end of it, a hope that the people we are being patient towards, long-suffering towards, will turn from whatever it is that's causing us to need to be long-suffering. Randy, you raised your hand for a moment. Oh, Roger.
Yeah, I think a great example for me would be if I enter into a contract for a debt, money, whatever, there's terms of that agreement, and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the grace offered or the mercy, you want to call that. But after that period of patience or the long suffering is done,
Yeah.
and you either have to pay the debt in full or incur the penalties that go along with it.
Yeah.
So it's a grace period, and that's what we're talking here. Is God is willing to set aside, he says it's going to happen,
Yeah.
for a period of time, that there will be a reckoning
Yeah.
at a certain period of time, and we know.
Yeah. Randy.
Just thinking about the word long suffering, and we're thinking about God. Ephesians 4 says that we can grieve the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as we're thinking about this nature of God, it's how is God suffering? He's suffering for a long, like Dan was mentioning, he is patient with, he's suffering through people rebelling against him and ignoring his offer of grace and mercy through
Yeah.
his son.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what I was, when you were asking about the word
Yeah.
long suffering, I was trying to think of it from God's perspective. How is God suffering
Absolutely.
for a long time?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a couple of things that struck me was that God would prefer to show mercy.
Mm-hmm.
That's what God would prefer.
Absolutely.
God is not wishing for any to perish. God has his preferences.
Yeah.
I would definitely rather show you mercy than wrath.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think the other thing is that the reason behind the patience is because the extreme value of what you're being patient over
Mhm.
is that one soul, one individual person is worth more than the entire universe, all the stuff in the universe. And so it really shows just the value of a single, isolated, average individual that has tremendous value, that it's an extreme tragedy for just one soul to be lost. It's an eternal optimism in God.
Yeah.
I mean, why go through and do all of this if only a few are going to pick the narrow way? There's eternal optimism in the character of God.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That brings us around. I remember one of my examples of was for mercy was last week. The first sign of mercy that were shown in the Bible, and the second, Adam and Eve when they sinned in the garden, and God was quick to show mercy to them. And now we might think, well, they were cursed and they were sent out of the garden. Well, he didn't kill them, and he made sure that they were taken care of. He prepared clothes for them from the skin of an animal. Cain likewise was offering sacrifices that God did not find pleasing. Cain grew jealous of his brother Abel, slew his brother Abel, and what was God's response? But to teach Cain and not show retribution in the moment, and even to offer Cain protection as he was afraid what other men would do to him when they found out. And that's a great mercy, and that is God preferring mercy over judgment. And from the very start, we're shown that from the very, very beginning. And another point that has just come out of this, and I'm so thankful for this discussion, for people speaking up, because things come to mind that otherwise wouldn't. When we are impatient or when we fail to show long suffering to others, what does that say about the way that we value them? Because if we value somebody, if we value our relationships with people in our lives, that is a strong driver to show long suffering and patience with them. Because we want to maintain that relationship. We want to maintain that, and we want to bring them around to rebuild that relationship. Whereas if we don't show long suffering, we don't value those people. We don't recognize them. And I think that's where like a great danger lies. I mean, we're all made in God's image. And who's to say that I'm more worthy of mercy and long suffering than my brother? So, anyways, thank you. Any other input? Yes?
One of the great examples of God's long suffering is in Genesis 15:16, where it tells Moses that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete, and the Amorites are not punished for 400 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm assuming you meant Exodus 15:16. Sorry to correct. You said Genesis, but I know Moses wasn't there. So, but yes, that is a great example.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Abraham. Oh, Abraham, not Moses. Okay. Yeah.
Abraham, he's right.
No, he was right. Sorry.
They'll have,
I heard Moses,
they'll have the land, but not until.
but not yet.
Till the Amorites have fulfilled their.
Got it. Yeah. Abraham and Amorites. No, and that's true. And we even see that's a great example, because we see that pattern in God's dealing not just with the Amorites. That's the first example, but we see that continued on. We see that continued on with the Israelites. We see that continued on with the Babylonians. Just empire after empire. We see Daniel's dream of the statue, and each had its turn, its place. And it wasn't until the fullness of time, until their iniquities were full, that God removes them. And so it's at every level of, at the individual, at society. Yes, Dan?
The parable that Jesus taught about the unmerciful servant,
Yeah.
who had a debt he could never pay, but he's asking this master, if you'll wait, I'll pay everything.
Yeah.
If you'll suffer with me through
Yeah.
this, I'll pay everything.
Yeah.
And so the master took pity, forgave him.
Yeah.
And he went to get his other
Yeah.
servant,
Yeah.
showed no long suffering
Yeah.
and no mercy. He
Yeah.
wanted it then, right now.
Yeah.
So those are those two opposites right there in that parable in Matthew chapter 18. So
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that actually, thank you for reminding me, that was the example of mercy that I gave last week that I couldn't remember at the start of this class. But that brings us to our next point. And when does it appear that God was not long-suffering? Or when does he withhold his long-suffering? Do we have examples of that? I don't have anything that comes to mind. But in understanding God's long-suffering, I think it's helpful to look at when he withholds it and when he gives it. And I'll start off with that example of that parable. God was long-suffering. In fact, he showed mercy so that the long-suffering was waived. He forgave it. But then when that servant was not long-suffering, when he was not merciful, God took that back. He withheld it. He punished the servant. Roger.
For 120 years, Noah built an ark,
Yeah?
and one day he shut the door.
Yeah?
That was the end of the long suffering.
That was the end of the long-suffering. So we'll say he was long-suffering up to a point there, and then he was done. That's good. Yes? Yes? Sodom and Gomorrah. He took his long-suffering back, yeah. That's a wonderful example, because there we see God does, he said if there were 10 righteous men in Sodom, I would withhold my judgment on it. But there wasn't even that. And so we do see lines. And I'm not saying this so that we can then discern, because I don't think it's healthy for us to take this and then say specifically, okay, well, there's 10 people in this church, so they must be good. There's 10 people in Bremerton, so it must be safe and good, and we can keep going. But to understand that there are limits. Dan, did you have something?
well, I was just thinking about God with Judah.
Mm-hmm.
He sent prophet after prophet after prophet to try to get them to come back.
Mm-hmm.
And it was part of my Bible reading this morning in Jeremiah, the 7th chapter. God sends Jeremiah to him, and he tells Jeremiah, don't pray for him. I won't listen to you. It's over.
Yeah.
I'm done with this. They're going into captivity.
Yeah.
My long suffering has come to an end.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think of times when judgment was quick. I think of Ananias and Sapphira, who came and they were giving of the land that they sold, and they said they gave all, but they had held some back for themselves. And judgment was swift in that matter. They lied. And yes?
Yeah, I was thinking of that, maybe out of the Bible, but, we may not know we don't have the whole backstory
Mm-hmm.
on those two examples.
Absolutely.
There may have been a lot of patience
Yeah.
leading up to that, because just from a reader of the text, it looks like, whoa, this is quick.
Yeah.
This is fast.
Yeah.
And there were other people like, and also Herod was eating with worms.
Yeah.
In the book of Acts as well. That's a pretty quick one. But I think knowing God's character, it looks like that there's always mercy leading up to stuff. But I think for us to realize is that, like in the passage of Genesis, you don't always know when your cup is full.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
don't assume you have tomorrow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, that brings something to mind. I think of Achan and the Israelites, and he took something from Jericho and held it for his family, a treasure from Jericho, spoils from Jericho. And the Israelites were punished for that until Achan brought himself forward, said it was him, and Achan and his family were consumed by the earth, I believe, or stoned at least, but they were killed. And that was an interesting one. That's always one that I struggled with when it comes to long-suffering.
They were stoned.
They were stoned, thank you. Yeah. Because what did his family do that was wrong, except for perhaps keep the secret with Achan? Maybe they knew about it, they were all in the tent together. But I think of like even the children, like even the young. And so often when we look at God's long-suffering, mercy, patience, and grace, we are focused on the physical life here. But the soul goes on afterwards. And I don't know, that an example was made of the family, and that essentially that sacrifice was made so that Israel could receive its grace from God afterwards. We don't know what the ultimate destination of those young children were. We don't know how God dealt with them. We don't know. Even with Achan, he came forward. That's an act of repentance. So we don't even know beyond that. Like, yeah, he was punished here on earth, but I can't say for certain where he is afterwards. And that is an example of long-suffering, mercy, and grace that goes beyond this life and into the next. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind here, is that sometimes an example is made of a person so that those around them can know what is right and is wrong in God's eyes and can live in this life accordingly. But that does not mean that an earthly punishment is not necessarily in line with a heavenly punishment. The clearest example in my mind is David's son.
And you just have to trust God's justice.
Absolutely.
He's going to be just. He's going to do what's right.
Yeah.
You know, he's a loving God. And so we just leave it at that.
Yeah. That's good. So we'll leave it at that. So having talked about times when God is and isn't long-suffering, I want to move on to how it feels to be on the receiving end of long-suffering. Has anybody ever been patient towards you? And this is something that's funny for me, because oftentimes when I'm on the receiving end of long-suffering, I don't know it until after it comes out and is made apparent to me that I've done something. I think of David again, who sinned with Bathsheba. He obviously knew he was doing something wrong, but he was going forward with it. And then Nathan came to him and accused him of it, and now he realizes God has been very patient with me. So what are examples? I mean, and you don't have to raise your hand, but I just want you to be thinking of this, because I think it's healthy to understand so we can know. Times in your life when people have been patient towards you, and times in your life when you've been on the receiving end of long-suffering. Likewise, thinking about how it feels to be long-suffering, how it feels to have that patience with others. Examples in your life when you've done that, and not to be puffed up and proud, but to recognize it and to learn from it, because we need to grow in this. We need to seek to embody this and know. And I feel it like it's important to reflect on that, because if you don't reflect on it, then each account is its own account. Each time you encounter something, it's like a brand new thing, and it's up to chance whether or not it's not all up to chance, but whether you handle it rightly or wrongly. But if we look back and can recognize, it felt like this, and this is why I did it, and this is why I'm going to continue to do it, in spite of how hard it is, we can be prepared for the next time. Yeah.
Just to give you an example, I cringe at the early congregations that had me as their preacher.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Dan.
Because I was horrible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and even in the time that I've been here, and this is like the third time, for instance, that we've gone through Acts.
Yeah.
I can hardly look at my notes from the first time because they seem so shallow and so. Anyway.
Yeah.
Congregations have been very long-suffering with me.
Well, thank you for giving that example. And I really appreciate that, because one thing I've appreciated about you going through Acts and Corinthians, Revelation, all these books with us, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, is hearing you say, I've taught this before. I've studied this many times, and I've never seen it like this before. And I've never looked at it this deeply. And you've been saying this, and I hear that, and it's such a blessing to me, because growing up in the church, we look at the person in the pulpit, and so often we just assume that they have studied this to perfection and they have a complete understanding. And that's a dangerous place for us to be in the church. It's also a dangerous place for the preacher. But to hear it said that I'm looking at this and I'm seeing things I didn't see, and I'm recognizing things I didn't recognize, that's wonderful. And it's important too, because I'm just so grateful for that example, thank you. How do you grow if you don't recognize the patience that people have had with you? How do you grow? How do you change if you don't recognize your failings? And then how much, it's just so, I can't find the positive words to explain it, but to recognize that grace has been shown you, that patience has been shown to you, that mercy has been shown to you, is you don't have to live in that past anymore. You don't have to hold on to that. You don't have to worry about the young preacher that you were, but you can just know, I'm free to move forward, to grow, and to improve. Thank you. Any other? Roger?
Yeah, cancer.
Mm-hmm.
50 years ago, it was almost certain that everybody that had it died.
Mm-hmm.
And through the progress of people learning how to deal with this, we've been able to extend things and even eradicate it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're given that diagnosis, there's nothing you can do but be patient and long-suffering. And
Yes.
let those that know what they're doing do the work. And
Yeah.
that's exactly what God does.
Yeah.
He knows what he's doing, let him do the work.
Yeah.
And we've got the instructions of it.
Yeah.
So we can get through this life. The last thing that happened to me was this. I thought that was, I'll get through this 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
It's been 11 months now. And they were right. It's going to take a year and a half to 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of hard to deal with when you're at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm seeing the end of that, and people see the end of the diagnosis of cancer
Yeah.
and all of those other things. So we can put it in a term that we do understand, but we can't fully appreciate.
Yeah. Yes.
Anybody that has children suddenly learns how much long suffering they must have
Mm-hmm.
received from their parents.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. In that regard, we've all been on the receiving end of long suffering because we've all had parents and we're all still here. So, yes.
It's easier for us to extend grace, mercy, and long suffering to people that we love.
Mm-hmm.
But if we understand the grace and mercy that we get from God,
Mm-hmm.
then we can extend that to people that we don't really have a relationship with,
Yeah.
knowing that our failings are their failings as well.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's an interesting, I want to push back just a little bit on that. I agree with you, but sometimes it's the people we love the dearest that we hold to the highest standards. And sometimes we can be more strict on them than we would be on people in our lives that we don't have a strong relationship with. And so I think it can go both ways. I think oftentimes, depending on what it is, we can be much easier and lenient on our family, forgiving of things that we otherwise might not be. But I want to caution us in that sometimes we hold people to a higher standard because we love them more and we are closer to them and we expect more of them. So, yeah. Any other? All right. Well, I'm going to wrap it up there. I know that was very open-ended. I want to think about it. I want us to think about it and not feel like we know that our God is long-suffering. I made the joke about parents and us still being here. Well, God is our Father and we are still here living, and so He is very patient with us, very long-suffering. And so many statements in the Bible call out to that and declare His long-suffering, His mercy, and His grace. And beyond those declarations, when you go and look at all the stories, every story of God's interaction with humanity is an example of His mercy and grace and long-suffering. Every story we have in the Bible shows His long-suffering, His mercy, and His grace. And if we look for it, we can learn more about how God behaves in that matter. Yes?
And sometimes if you're going like, this is really hard, it's good to ask, it's good to pause and say, well, what's the alternative?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the plan B? What would be? And when you see people who are impatient, it's not a good look.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of go like, I don't want to be like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also when you see the big picture, there are times that God's patience means,
Yeah.
you know, because I mean the world might be so bad. You're saying, "Come, Lord Jesus."
Mm-hmm.
God says, "Not yet,"
Mm-hmm.
which means that sin continues. People do terrible things to people.
Mm-hmm.
That continues. Like, why can't we just bring that to an end? That bringing it to an end means that all the people we know are doomed. No second chance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I think when you look at it at the big picture and you look at what's out in eternity, wish that on my worst enemy. And I think that helps us with, I mean, there's a wrath coming up that I could not
Yeah.
it's at a divine level. So I think it's, and you make a good point when you're growing imperfections, you're humble, and when you realize, why doesn't God do something about it? Well, you understand what doing something about it means.
Yeah.
Doing something about it means, story's over, folks, that's it.
Yeah.
You know, heaven and hell. I think in that sense, I think it's easier to say, okay, I trust God's timing, I trust Him on this, I'm gonna continue to reach out and try to reach my neighbors
Yeah.
and save them, and you know, you live long enough and you've seen enough people come back to the Lord late in life.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't have that optimistic as long as there's time, there's hope.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Any other comments before I hand this over to Henry? All right. Need my mic.
Yeah.
Can you mute us real quick while I hand this over? Otherwise, it's going to be loud. It's muted up.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. Good morning, church. We have a few minutes to delve into our next section. Try to cover as much as we can. But our next section that we're going to be talking about and opening up a discussion on is the goodness, compassion, forgiveness, and the immutability of God. Now, those are some very interesting topical attributes of God. And the point is that some of these, I think, were just absolutely incredible. That we'll open up and discuss. Our first one we want to talk about this morning is goodness. Let me ask you a question. If you were God, would you have changed the way God created us? I didn't think so. Because God, no one's going to be able to do better than what He's done. So, let's look at goodness, which is, to me, one of the more powerful attributes that God has. If we stopped, took a deep breath, and held it, how long could we do that? Not very long. And then what are we going to be forced in? Is the air that we breathe. We're going to be depending on that air to give us the relief from holding our breath so long. That air is provided to us because of God's goodness. The sun, we could burn up if that sun wasn't giving us the direct heat that we need to sustain ourselves on this earth. That heat comes from that sun that God has given us out of goodness. He has given us everything that we need in order to live on this earth. He created this earth for us to live in. And I think about Adam and Eve and where he placed them to live. The Garden of Eden. That was paradise. They were living in a place where there was nothing else that they needed. But they failed him. But when God created this earth and put all the essential things that we need, the food, the plants, to help us when we get sick, all these things were created out of goodness for us that he's created. But look at man now. And even in the days when he have created us, Abel, Keehn, did they demonstrate goodness that God was looking for? I don't think so. Well, Keehn killed his brother. And that brought, I would imagine, a tremendous sorrow to God to have that happen, because he's nothing but goodness. And to have his creation start to kill his own brother was something I don't think God was very pleased with. But that's humans. That's the difference between God's goodness and our goodness. And we don't have a whole lot of time this morning that I wanted to go to, but we're going to continue those. We can see how the God goodness, we can't put ourselves on the same level of goodness that God is. We realize that. But God does expect some goodness from us. When he created us, he didn't expect for Cain to kill Abel, I'm sure, but it happened. Since then, man has been shown evilness throughout that day, since that day. So, what do we look at when we talk about goodness? Let's define. Can someone define goodness for me? In your eyes, what does goodness mean? Yes, Kate.
I would say like an intrinsic characteristic of being kind or good, like quality about you.
Yes, absolutely, I agree. And who's that back there? Is that Norm?
Benefits everybody.
Excuse me?
Benefits everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I had that goodness is pleasant, is joyful, it's agreeable, it's admirable, and worthy. Genesis 1:31 kind of encapsulate goodness. When God looked at his creation, he said, this is good. God said that. And so we know that whatever he does, it's good. Because he is good. He's inherently good. Yes, Gonson.
I'm going to add into that complete or full.
Yes, complete and full. Yes, that's
I just think of that when it was found that he did not have a helpmeet suitable, that was not good.
right.
It was incomplete.
That's correct.
It was unfulfilled.
And he corrected that situation right then and there. Very good point. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think as moral, it's the absence of evil, and so it would be a whole or complete, where there's no darkness.
Right.
You know, God is light and there's no darkness. It would be a love of those things. It would be the absence of selfishness and like darkness
Yes.
in your heart or manipulation or
Yes.
trying to get, it is a love of virtue, of the virtues.
Mm-hmm.
It is, you might say, integrity, I think would go along there. Those are all together. It's far different than just, a lot of people today talk about being kind, but you can ignore evil and do that.
Mm-hmm.
This is something really inherently strong
Right.
here that also would not, it doesn't wink and it doesn't just let evil, it doesn't say nothing, it doesn't say anything in the presence of evil. It must speak out. Goodness must speak out against evil.
That's right. And that's one of the points is that that's just the reasons why God he's the only one that has that type of goodness, that inherent goodness in him, that we don't possess that. But although we are to live good, be good people, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk more about in the next lesson. We didn't get too much on goodness, but we'll finish it up and be ready for next week. Thank you for your participation.